It is easy to forget to record. So Dugan Becker serves as a community liaison officer at Mayflower Wind, leading community engagement efforts within Rhode Island and the south coast of Massachusetts. Prior to joining Mayflower Wind, he worked at the UMass Clean Energy Extension, helping 280 Massachusetts towns establish, track, and work towards their clean energy and emissions reduction goals under the state's Green Communities programs. So really exciting to hear, we're really excited to hear him tell us more about the current status and potential of offshore wind energy for Rhode Island. We're going to record the talk and then we'll have a chance to discuss after we stop recording at the end.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Abby. I will go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see that all right? Right.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. It's going to be really tough to follow Bill McKibben's excellent talk from last month, but I will definitely try my best. So offshore wind is something that I've been really passionate about for the last 5 or 6 years. And more than that, it's something that, you know, kind of gives me hope in the face of climate change. And I think that's really what drew me to it in this capacity. So I hope that, you know, maybe after today's presentation, some of you will leave with some of that hope as well. As you can imagine, though, offshore wind is a really vast and complex topic. So I put together way too many slides and we're still only going to scratch the surface. But I'm more than happy to follow up with anybody if there are questions remaining after today's talk. That being said, dive right in. So you guys already heard my introduction. I'm a community liaison officer with Mayflower Wind. Basically what that means is I am in the communities, educating people about offshore wind, educating people about the Mayflower project specifically, answering questions, and probably most importantly, just collecting stakeholder feedback to kind of shape what that project looks like at the end of the day. Previously, I was working at the UMass Clean Energy Extension under the Department of Energy Resources in Massachusetts on the Green Communities program. Heard a little bit about that, but that's really kind of what got me into the role of engaging with communities and kind of helping, you know, at the local level, helping people accomplish their, you know, clean energy and emissions reduction goals, you know, like I do today. So academically, beyond that, I studied at UMass Amherst, where I got a BS in Natural Resource Conservation, as well as a Master's of Science in Sustainability Science. So my focus has really always been on climate mitigation specifically. And then within the last few years, I started to drill down a little bit and really focus on offshore wind as a vessel for that mitigation, because I was really moved by, you know, the scale of potential impact associated with offshore wind energy. So that being said, I'd like to start off on a low note. I'm sure this will not be a surprise to anybody in this audience, but we are not in a good place. We are not on a good path. In Rhode Island specifically, temperatures have increased more than 3 degrees over the last century, and some areas of Rhode Island, Newport in particular, have seen more than a foot of sea level rise over that same period. And these trends aren't slowing down at current. So, you know, sea level rise predictions are up to, you know, an additional 9 feet potentially over the next 100 years, you know, 10 times increase in coastal flooding, just a whole slew of negative changes in our climate coming our way. And again, as I'm sure everybody in this audience knows, you know, it's no surprise that these changes are the direct result of greenhouse gas emissions, largely those related to the combustion of fossil fuels and our energy systems. So the pie chart on the left here breaks down Rhode Island's emissions by source. This graph is a bit outdated, as you can see, 2016, but at the time, electricity generation in particular was responsible for about 26% of Rhode Island's emissions, preceded only by transportation at 36%. So one important thing to keep in mind when looking at this graph is that, you know, even though electricity only represents 26% here, virtually every other category represented on that pie chart. So whether it be transportation, you know, residential heating, commercial heating, these are all sectors that could be electrified, right? So if we were to accomplish, you know, a net zero grid, the rest of these industries, the rest of these sectors, you know, should be following shortly after. But getting there obviously won't be easy. In 2020, natural gas accounted for nearly 90% of Rhode Island's electricity generation, which is the largest share of any state. And kind of recognizing that this is an issue, as you heard about in the statements earlier, Rhode Island just signed legislation last week to become 100% renewable by 2033. So congratulations. That is I believe that is the most ambitious net zero goal in America currently. So that is excellent. The graph on the right here is a little bit outdated. I think Rhode Island initially had a goal of becoming net zero by 2030, but 2033 is still good. So give them props on that for sure. So looking at that graph, you can see where the base load is in terms of, what the total electricity consumption is, and then where we are at in terms of renewable production. So if you look at 2024, you see a significant uptick in renewable production there. That is when the 400 megawatt Revolution Wind project comes online. So that is the first and only offshore wind project currently slated to deliver energy to Rhode Island. Which is great. Obviously it's making a pretty significant impact, as you can see from that graph. But what you can also see from that graph is even after that project comes online, there is still quite a gap to become 100% renewable. So some studies were done to assess what is the best path to reach that 100% renewable mark there. And these studies kind of revealed that offshore wind is potentially one of the most efficient ways to get there, with only 900 to 1100 megawatts needed of offshore wind to reach that goal. Whereas, retail solar in comparison, you would need 3 or 4 times that amount to still hit that 100% mark. That's not to say that any one renewable source is going to be the solution there, but it just kind of goes to show that offshore wind has some really strong potential in that regard.
Can I interrupt?
Please do.
I don't understand this slide. Why would you need a different number of megawatts?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you asked.
Another.
Yes. So this is the generation capacity, right? So megawatts versus megawatt hours. So offshore wind and we'll get into this a little bit later. Offshore wind, one of the reasons why why it has so much potential is because it's quite efficient. So offshore winds are really strong and they're really consistent. Significantly more so than onshore wind, for example. So you would need more turbines onshore to reach that same amount of generation as you would offshore, just because, the resources offshore are a bit more abundant. Does that make sense?
Yes, got it.
Perfect. Good question, though. And also, as we mentioned earlier a little bit today, there was legislation just passed this morning where Rhode Island committed to seek out an additional 600 to 1,000 additional megawatts of offshore wind energy. So, assuming that the final decision ends on the higher end of that range, 900 to 1,000, it's very possible that Rhode Island could be, 100% renewable in the next few years alone, solely off of offshore wind. But this is one area here where you all, as activists, please use your voices and encourage your legislators and whatnot to pursue, that higher number of 900 to 1,000 rather than that 600 mark, because that 600 mark wouldn't quite get us there. So just to zoom out a little bit and talk about offshore wind at the national level. So this image is a graph showing the offshore wind speeds in the United States. As a whole, the United States has more than 2,000 gigawatts of offshore wind energy potential. And if you're not an energy nerd and you need an equivalency for that there, 2,000 gigawatts is about 4 times greater than every existing generation source in America combined. So it is just a ridiculous amount of energy potential. If we were to harness just 1% of that, it would power about 6.5 million homes, or every single home in New England, or I believe it's like the 13 smallest states in America combined. So it's, just 1% of that would still be a significant contribution towards our national and, regional and local renewable energy goals there. To make things even better, right? So looking at this graph, the US population is disproportionately distributed along the coastline, right? So 40% of the US population lives in the 10% of land along the coast, which means that a huge chunk of the population just has like readable access to these robust offshore wind resources. And New England in particular, as you can see on this map, is really in a hot spot. So New England not only has some of the strongest offshore wind resources in America, but some of the strongest offshore wind resources in the world. So we are really in a good spot for it. And just really high level overview, some of the benefits of offshore wind that kind of set it apart from the rest. Emissions reductions is first on there. That's just stating the obvious here. The reason we care about offshore wind, or at least one of the prevailing reasons we care about offshore wind, is because it's a robust renewable energy source and we need to transition to renewable energy. The second issue there, or sorry, the second benefit there, scalability. So there is certainly a place for all renewable energy sources. We're going to need them all to combat this colossal issue that we have in front of us with climate change. But the scale of offshore wind is difficult to achieve through other means. So just to put that in perspective for you, a standard offshore wind turbine going in the waters nowadays is about 13 megawatts, or at least that's what these first round of projects will be using in New England. To install 13 megawatts of residential solar, for example, you would need about 2,400 homes, 2,600 homes, something in that range. So just like I said, it's really difficult to achieve that scale through other means. So, and that's just one turbine, right? So looking at some of these projects, the Mayflower project, for example, is 2,400 megawatts. So to meet that same amount of energy with residential solar, you would need about 6.25 million homes. So that's every single home in New England, including individual installments on apartments and that kind of thing. So really just to kind of illustrate the scale that you can achieve through offshore wind it can be difficult to achieve through other means. Strong, consistent resources. We talked about that a little bit ago with Justin's question. Offshore, the wind is strong and it's consistent. That's partly due to the fact that there's just less friction offshore, right? So onshore, you've got trees and mountains and buildings, lots of obstacles that essentially just slow the wind down as it goes, whereas the ocean is relatively flat in comparison. So wind speeds pick up really, really high. There's also pretty consistent temperature differences within the ocean itself, as well as between the ocean and land. So you just get really strong and consistent wind out there. Job creation and supply chain growth is one that is hard to overestimate when you're talking about offshore wind. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but we're essentially looking at tens of thousands of new jobs solely in the offshore wind industry and associated trades within the next decade or so. Accessibility, again, we touched on this. The population is disproportionately located along the coast, so a huge amount of people have easy access to these resources. And then just to touch on the last two here quickly, energy independence, right? So you can kind of say this about any renewable energy form, but the less energy we have to import from other countries, the better. And I think especially with this last point here, fixed low cost energy, as we've seen in the recent months with the conflict in Ukraine and gas prices and prices, pretty much everything else just going through the roof. Making our energy here at home is certainly something to be sought after. And specifically that last point, the fixed low cost energy, right? So I can't speak for the industry as a whole nationally, but I know at least in New England, there are requirements that when a developer goes to sell their energy to the grid, to the state, or to the region rather, there's a requirement that price per kilowatt hour is a fixed amount. So regardless of supply chain obstacles or demand or global conflict, that price per kilowatt hour generated by these offshore wind farms is going to be the same no matter what. So you're really not going to see these crazy fluctuations that we've gotten used to recently. And obviously, this is just a super high overview of some of the benefits, but I thought those were important things to get out there. U.S. development. So recognizing the immense potential of offshore wind, President Biden recently established a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which is right around enough energy to power about 10 million homes. And I think 78 million or so metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions reductions per year. Nationally, we are on track to meet that goal. We've got a little over 35 gigawatts in the development pipeline currently. And to put that in perspective, our current installed capacity for offshore wind, so what is currently in the water nationwide, is about 1/1000th of that amount. We've got 42 megawatts, 7 turbines, 5 of which are in Rhode Island, so congratulations. But those 7 turbines that we have nationwide are also about half the size of the ones that are going to be going in the water. So it is, we're really looking at exponential growth in the offshore wind sector over the next decade or so. And thank goodness, because we certainly need this kind of rapid development to address climate change. So currently there are about 39 distinct offshore areas being considered and or developed in the United States. It's certainly possible that not all of these areas will be developed at the end of the day. Many of the areas shown on this map here are what are known as call areas, which means the US government, specifically the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is kind of the key federal group that oversees the entire industry here, has identified these call areas as locations that are of interest for offshore wind. And they're actively conducting research, actively collecting feedback from stakeholders, and that'll kind of inform how they proceed on those locations. But if everything checks out, the next step from a call area is to essentially put that area up for lease auction. So it's a competitive bidding process between developers, and whoever wins will eventually spend the following decade surveying, designing, permitting, and eventually constructing the offshore wind project itself. So to touch a little bit more on that 30 gigawatt by 2030 target, what exactly does that look like? Well, for starters, it's going to take almost almost $100 billion. $97 billion there is the estimate that I've seen. It's going to take about 2,110 offshore wind turbines. Again, bearing in mind we have 7 currently. It's going to take about $500 million in port infrastructure upgrades, because these offshore wind components are massive, and most of the ports we have nationally just simply cannot withstand the scale and the weight of these components, but we'll touch on that a little bit more later. And then one of the most exciting parts here is 83,000 new jobs, and that's direct and indirect, but either way, I mean, it's certainly the introduction of a brand new industry, and those effects really kind of cascade in terms of job creation. So zooming in a little bit more, focus on New England here. And if you walk away with one thing from this presentation, I just want to stress how important it is to take a regional lens when you're thinking about offshore wind, and not just a state level lens. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that New England shares an energy grid, right? So regardless if it's Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, it all feeds into the same grid. More important, or in addition to that, we're a pretty small region, right? So the economic benefits, whether it be job creation or what have you, they don't stop at state borders. So it's really something we need to approach as a region. Yeah. So there are currently 9 projects off the coast of New England, southern New England rather, about 750,000 acres. So, huge scale here, with about 13,000 megawatts of generation potential. So that's right around 4 to 5 million homes that these projects here could power. Of that 13,000 megawatts, only about half has been procured. So that means that only about half of that energy has been bought by the state. So we were talking a little bit earlier about how Rhode Island, put out a solicitation, or they will be putting out a solicitation to buy an additional, up to additional 1,000 megawatts. So that, for example, would add to this total here of the amount that has been procured so far, but still a long way to go before all of these projects are delivering their full capacity to the grid. Listed out some of the projects here and their various sizes and whatnot. But one other thing I kind of wanted to point out here, besides, the fact that these are all offshore wind projects and they're all off the coast of New England, does anybody have a guess what these 9 projects have in common? Feel free to speak up.
Could you please repeat the question?
Yes, sure. Yep. So we're looking at 9 projects here. Besides, the obvious, they're all offshore wind projects, they're all off the coast of New England. Do we have any guesses on what these 9 projects also have in common?
Can I try that?
Please do.
They all are are in the way of migratory bird, bird migratory routes. And they are, many of them, right smack dab in the middle of what's left of the North Atlantic right wells. I think there's like 260 of them left, and they're being put right in the middle of where the whale's nurseries is. We don't know how it's going to impact the wells. Certainly laying the cables and the sonar is, I mean, what is that going to do? There's so many questions about how this is going to affect the oceans and the animals that live there that have not been looked at or studied in any reasonable manner in this headlong rush to install these. Is that what they have in common? They're all.
That is not what they have in common, but I appreciate you bringing that up. Certainly, marine concerns and avian concerns are definitely something that the industry as a whole has been looking at, and I'm more than happy to speak to that at length. We'll get to this a little bit further on, but part of the reason why a single one of these projects takes 10, 15 years to develop is because there's a copious amount of research and collaboration and permitting that needs to be done to really demonstrate that there are not going to be significant negative impacts to those kind of species that you're speaking of. The right whale in particular is one that the industry as a whole is collaborating on too.
Perhaps I could try again then. They are all dependent upon mining.
Constance, so that might be enough. We appreciate this line of advocacy that you're inserting, but this is kind of, why don't you save your questions for the end of the talk, because I think you're distracting from what was meant to be kind of a rhetorical question about this particular slide.
Sorry about that.
That's
no,
right.
no, that's quite all right. And I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, certainly that is, one of the hot topics in the industry and one that, it needs to be discussed. But you're actually not too far off, right? So what these 9 projects have in common is that they are at least partially funded by oil and gas companies. So, being an environmentalist myself, I certainly raised an eyebrow at that. What do these companies, why do these companies want to invest in renewable energy? And having been in the industry for a while, I, have some ideas as to why this might be the case, right? First and foremost is capital. These projects are very expensive. Just to give you, one example there, a single lease, right? So one of these blocks just sold off the coast or just leased off the coast of New York for $1.1 billion. And that payment is a one-time instant payment. It needs to be paid on the spot. It is not paid off over time. And there are maybe a handful of companies in the world that just have that kind of liquidity around and, have the ability to invest in something of this scale. And it doesn't just stop there, obviously. There's several $1 billion that need to be spent over over a decade before any one of these projects generates a dime. So that's reason one. The other reason is there's also not a whole lot of industries that currently work in the offshore space that develop infrastructure offshore. So a lot of these companies do have experience. A lot of the, surveying vessels, for example, studying the seafloor, studying, the marine life and the fauna, they, transcend that boundary of, fossil fuels to offshore wind. And then also, and then additionally, these fossil fuel companies do have the lion's share of the energy market at current, right? Which is something to be discussed, but something that Bill McKibben discussed last month rather, is that these companies aren't just going to go away overnight. The clean energy transition is kind of just that. It is a transition, right? So if there is a path for these companies to transition into renewable energy and do it in a sustainable way, do it in a just way, that's something that needs to be supported. And I think that personally is why I was kind of motivated to join this industry as well, and kind of help the industry as a whole, and kind of really just help nationally help us get to a point where that transition is happening and it is appealing to these companies. So With that being said, I want to zoom in a little bit and look at the Mayflower project in particular. So obviously this is my domain, this is my area of expertise, but really I kind of wanted to just zoom into a specific project so that, you know, as a whole, we can look at, you know, what the components are that really make up an offshore wind project. So this is just an example here. The Mayflower project in particular might be of interest to you all because it does have some infrastructure in Rhode Island, particularly in the Sakonnet River and Portsmouth, which we'll get to a little bit later. But the Mayflower project, so it's 149 turbines, up to 149 turbines, generating up to 2,400 megawatts of energy to power about 1 million homes. Delivering power in 2 places, to the north in Falmouth, and to the northwest at Brayton Point in Somerset, Massachusetts. So if those of you that don't know about Brayton Point, it actually used to be the site of a coal plant. So it was the last coal plant to close in Massachusetts, or in New England, I believe. And it was also the dirtiest coal plant in America. So there's certainly a story to be told there about the clean energy transition. Super high level overview, and I've got way too many slides for the amount of time that I've left, so maybe I'll just skim through some of these, but you know, just kind of give you an idea of the infrastructure that goes into an offshore wind project. You obviously have your turbines offshore. Those are supported by foundations. That's what, you know, connects them to the seafloor. Each individual turbine is connected via inter-array cables, which kind of aggregates the energy at an offshore substation, ramps it up to speed before it can be delivered to shore. In the case of the Mayflower project, or in a handful of other projects, there might be an intermediate onshore crossing before it gets to its final destination. But eventually, when it makes final landfall, there will be an additional converter station where, again, you know, that energy gets prepared to be delivered into the grid and eventually make to your homes and businesses and whatnot. Offshore. Across the entire New England energy area, there is a uniform grid pattern, right? So every turbine, every substation is 1 nautical mile apart on a north, south, east, west grid. And this was kind of decided in collaboration with existing maritime users, whether it be, you know, fishermen or, you know, shipping vessels, as well as the U.S. Coast Guard, to determine, you know, what are the needs of these existing industries so they can still utilize the space, and, you know, what is needed for safe navigation regardless of weather and, you know, sea type and you know, all that good stuff. So just kind of help you visualize what that looks like. This is a 90-foot vessel, so this is, you know, a pretty significantly sized vessel. This is a rendering of what, you know, a ship of that size would look like in the offshore area. This is actually a screenshot from an offshore model that we had developed that allows the user to be, you know, plopped behind the wheel of a you know, boat and navigate through the area and all those various weather types that I was talking about. So I'll actually be down in Point Judith on Friday talking to fishermen and showing off this model so that they can kind of have an idea for, you know, what it will be like to be out there in a few years. Talk about the turbines a little bit. So, you know, when we talk about why is the potential of offshore wind, you know, larger than the onshore, right? If you look at the average onshore turbine here, about 460 feet, and then you look at that turbine in the middle, the GE Halide X, you can see that the offshore turbine is about twice as big. So these are the GE model in the middle there is what Vineyard Wind will be using in their offshore wind project scheduled to go online next year. So you can see that just the scale of renewable energy offshore is quite impressive. Mayflower has not yet picked our offshore wind turbines because we're still a few years out from construction, and in the industry, these turbines are growing at such a rate that you really want to hold off and until the last minute, because by that point there might be a 15 megawatt turbine, and you could power an additional 250,000, 500,000 homes with off that difference alone. Here's the substructures I talked about, the foundations. This is essentially just what connects the turbine to the floor. Yeah, I gotta buzz through these because I know we're a bit short on time, and I'll make sure I want to leave time for questions. Quickly, just touching on the export cables themselves, right? So this is the route that Mayflower will take in the Sakonnet to deliver power in Brayton Point. One thing I want to highlight here is the export cable corridor, right? So it's between 1,600 and 2,300 feet wide. It's obviously quite a wide corridor. The cables themselves are only about a foot wide. So the reason you want all that extra space is to enable what's known as micro routing. So it essentially allows you to be really precise and really detailed with the placement of the cable in a given area. So, if there is a sensitive habitat or a boulder or a shipwreck, having that corridor to navigate within obviously allows you to be a little bit more precise and avoid any potential obstacles like that. Moving on. One question I get a lot is, how are these cables brought ashore? And it's actually one of my favorite parts of the industry. I think it's pretty interesting here. So there's this system or this technique known as horizontal directional drilling. So as the name implies, this system allows you to drill in a given direction below the surface to avoid surface impacts, right? So beaches in particular, intertidal zones are usually home to, highly prized species, really, or even just beaches alone, residents and whatnot. Everybody loves their beaches. So in order to avoid disrupting those surface areas, horizontal directional drilling allows you to drill up to 90 feet below any given surface and pop out on the other end, so that that area is left undisturbed. In Portsmouth, for example, where Mayflower has a short 2-mile stretch on land before delivering to Brayton Point, one of the routes that we're considering, it includes a golf course, right? And obviously we're not going to dig up a golf course, plop a cable in and go on our way. So horizontal directional drilling enables us to just completely circumvent that area just by going well below it. It also helps avoid, some of you may have heard at Block Island, there were some issues with cables becoming uncovered, and horizontal directional drilling really kind of mitigates those concerns because by just having it so far below the surface. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, right? But how does a project like this get designed? How do you decide the routes, where the infrastructure is going to go? It starts with lots and lots of surveys and due diligence. So these are just a couple examples here. Obviously, we're looking at the seafloor, we're looking at flora and fauna. We really need to understand, have a comprehensive understanding of every potential impact, every species, stakeholder that is at play, so that we can make informed decisions on project design, right? So part of that, especially on the socioeconomic side, is engaging with existing maritime users, right? So obviously in Rhode Island in particular, the fishing industry has a huge presence, and they're obviously, somebody that needs to be involved in this decision-making process. Mayflower, as well as the rest of the developers offshore, have dedicated fishery liaisons who just spend all of their time engaging with these stakeholders and making sure that, whatever the final design ends up being, that it works for all parties involved. Also, lots and lots of permits go into the project design process. So the Mayflower project in particular needs about 60 permits from about 30 different regulatory agencies at the federal, state, and local levels. So this really kind of feeds back into that due diligence, right? So, I mean, you've got to keep in mind that there are, lots of laws and protections that ensure that, the right whale, for example, the Marine Mammal Protection Act or the Migratory Birds Treaty. Like, there are so many protections in place that help shape this progress. And in order to gain all of these permits, you really need to demonstrate your due diligence and illustrate to, that degree that you're not going to be impacting these species or, whatever it may be. Yep, just a high level overview of the Mayflower project benefits to the region. Obviously, we talked about jobs, ratepayer savings, right? So the price for offshore wind currently is one of the lowest cost energy sources in America currently. And yep, sorry, just buzzing over these because I know we're a bit short on time. One other important thing that I wanted to touch on here is the bidding process, right? So a power purchase agreement. Rhode Island just announced that they're looking for 600 to 1,000 additional megawatts. That is essentially a commitment to purchase power from a developer. But what that process looks like is, various developers would bid saying, we will sell you our energy for this amount of money, but that is not all that goes into a bid. So one of the other things that goes into a bid is, the state, whether it be Rhode Island, Massachusetts, they ask, okay, so this is the price you'll give it to us for, but what else will you do for the community? So economic development investments and commitments are a significant part of that bid process as well. So Mayflower, for example, in our current power purchase agreements, have committed $115 million in community investments between things like ports and infrastructure, DEI, research and innovation, and then offshore wind training and workforce development. Because we mentioned that 80,000 jobs by 2030. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of training that needs to be done. So some of these investments can go towards developing that workforce as well. So I will make the slide deck available because I think there's a lot of good stuff in here that we didn't exactly have time to get to, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. But just looking at Rhode Island as a whole and where they fit into the offshore wind industry, I mean, obviously the blue economy in Rhode Island is really strong. So you've got a lot of assets that can support the offshore wind industry, whether it be ports or there's a ton of blue economy research and innovation going on, as well as just people that are thinking about jobs in the blue economy like offshore wind. And then just a quick jurisdictional snapshot, right? So Revolution Wind, as I mentioned, is currently the only project slated to deliver power to Rhode Island, but that does not mean it is the only project that Rhode Island has jurisdiction over. So the areas here highlighted on the map, the GLDs, are kind of special exceptions where normally state boundaries and I want to say two or 3 miles off the coast and then past that is federal jurisdiction. Rhode Island actually has a special case where these GLDs extend far past that under the argument that the resources in the areas support Rhode Island's economy, so they should have some kind of say over how those areas are used. So a number of the projects are either located within that area or at the very least they have cables going through that area. So Rhode Island actually does have quite a bit of influence over the New England industry beyond just the amount of energy that they're slated to procure currently. Permitting. So this is one thing I definitely this could be a presentation all on its own. It's definitely something worth looking into further here. But I really just wanted to include this slide to highlight the opportunities for public comments and public hearings. Seeing as you're all, a group of well-informed advocates here looking to, bolster the renewable energy industries. These are a couple of opportunities here at the federal and state level to get involved and really make your voices heard. But that being said, certainly you should do your due diligence and do your research about any given project before you, support it or speak towards it. So I've included quite a few resources here. Again, I'll share the slide deck so you have access to all of these. But federal, state, and general information here, as well as links to the existing projects' websites, so that you can, explore them as you wish, or follow project updates, that kind of thing. You heard a little bit about Mayflower Wind tonight. I went through some of that kind of quickly, but we are having a Rhode Island Community Forum on August 3rd. We haven't even announced it yet, so you guys are getting a little sneak preview there. But if you're interested in hearing any more about the project, I would hope to see you there, or here's my email. So you can definitely shoot me an email if I don't have time to get to your questions tonight. But yeah, hopefully that wasn't too fast. Hopefully you got some good info in there, but yeah, thank you for having me. And now I am happy to take some questions.